The velvet midnight pulsed with cheap thrills, but dancer Zara offered something profound, a silent conversation with hidden pain. Amidst fleeting gazes, one man truly saw her art. Their unspoken bond would lead her from the club's shadows to a surprising new stage, where connection blossomed from despair. The bass drum was a physical thing in the velvet midnight, a second, synthetic heartbeat thumping against your ribs. The air, thick with the ghosts of spilled whiskey and a dozen competing perfumes, was a stale blanket, tasting of regret and cheap sugar. On a small, perpetually sticky-floored stage, bathed in a jaded wash of purple and blue light, Zara moved like a secret whispered in a crowded room. She was 25, but on that stage she could be any age, any story. While other dancers offered a frantic, almost desperate energy for crumpled dollar bills and fleeting, predatory attention, Zara's performance was a quiet, deliberate language. She wasn't selling a fantasy of availability. She was offering a moment of recognition. Her first act each night was to tune out the noise, the clatter of glasses, the shouted jokes, the raw, insistent beat, and scan the periphery. She looked past the boisterous groups to find the islands of solitude. The man hunched over his drink, his shoulders a permanent arch of the week's weight, the woman staring blankly into the middle distance, lost in a sea of sound. For the man, her spin would slow to a liquid grace, her arms unfolding not in invitation, but in a gesture that mimicked the release of a heavy coat, a silent acknowledgement of his burden. For the woman, a flicker of Zara's fingers might trace the invisible shape of a falling tear, a shared, unspoken sorrow that was both hers and not. It was a strange, fragile art form, practiced in the least artistic place imaginable. It earned her little, just enough to scrape by, and the open scorn of the club's manager, a man named Sal whose mantra was, "More flash, less feelings, Zara. Nobody pays to watch a poem." But this quiet defiance was all she had left. It was the fractured echo of a dream she'd once breathed, the girl who once believed her future was in a professional corps de ballet. Sometimes, if she closed her eyes for a second too long, she could still feel the smooth, worn wood of a proper bar beneath her hand. This dimly lit, sticky platform was a universe away, but it was her only way to speak, to offer the one thing she still possessed, a fleeting, fragile connection in the overwhelming noise. Her reality existed a world away from the velvet midnight's artificial twilight. It was a cramped third-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that had long given up on gentrifying. The apartment always smelled faintly of damp plaster, and her downstairs neighbor's curry. Taped to the wall above her lumpy mattress was the only relic of her former life, a faded promotional poster from a local production of Swan Lake. A much younger Zara, all of 18, was captured midair, her face a mask of serene focus. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection in the glass covering it and see the exhaustion that now lived permanently in the shadows under her eyes. That girl on the poster didn't know the crushing weight of a parent's declining health, the constant, gnawing anxiety of the monthly bill from the Meadowlark Senior Care Facility. That anxiety was a constant hum beneath the surface of her life, and Sal, the club manager, was an expert at turning up the volume. "I'm running a business, not a therapy session," he'd barked at her just last week, his breath sour with stale coffee. "The guys want to forget their troubles, not watch you dance them out. More sizzle, Zara, less interpretive dance." He'd made a face as if the very concept was offensive. Each criticism was a small cut, reminding her how precariously she was balanced on the edge of ruin. But then there was Wednesday. Wednesday was for him. He had become a fixture in her week, a silent, unmoving landmark in the shifting sea of faces. His name, she'd learned from a sympathetic bartender, was Tom Caldwell. He was 71. Every Wednesday, at precisely 9 o'clock, he would appear and take the same corner booth, the one with the torn upholstery that everyone else avoided. He would order a single glass of whiskey neat and place it on the table where it would sit, largely untouched for the next 2 hours. He never spoke to anyone. He never looked at his phone. He just watched her, His gaze was unlike any other she'd ever encountered in a place like this. It held none of the usual hunger or casual appraisal. It was focused, intensely so, but also profoundly respectful. He wasn't watching her body, he was reading her movements. He saw the hesitation in a turn, the flicker of defiance in a sharp extension of her arm, the deep well of sadness in a slow, deliberate collapse to the floor. For the 2 hours she was on stage, Zara felt like she wasn't in the velvet midnight at all. She was performing a private recital for an audience of one. He was the only person who seemed to understand the language she was speaking. And though they had never exchanged a single word, his quiet, unwavering attention had become the thread she clung to, the proof that her silent stories weren't just disappearing into the smoky, indifferent air. The floor dropped out from under her world on a Tuesday afternoon with a phone call. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a nurse from Meadowlark. Her mother had caught the flu, and while it wasn't life-threatening yet, her already fragile health meant she required intensive, round-the-clock monitoring. The nurse used terms like respiratory support and specialized observation. Zara only heard the final part clearly: a mandatory supplementary fee for enhanced care. $800 a month for a minimum of 3 months. The number echoed in the tiny, silent apartment. $800. It might as well have been 1 million. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her lungs. She spent the next hour making frantic calls, her voice trembling as she was rejected by 2 different payday loan companies. There was no one else to ask. That night, swallowing a knot of pride and terror, she knocked on the door of Sal's cramped, cigar-stale office. He was counting a wad of cash and didn't look up. "What?" he grunted. "Sal, Her voice was thin, barely a whisper. "I need to ask for an advance on my pay. It's an emergency, my mom." He stopped counting and finally looked at her. A short, humorless bark of a laugh escaped his lips. "An advance? On what?" "Your artistic integrity fund." He leaned back, the springs of his chair groaning in protest. "Zara, you barely make your quota as it is. I've been patient. I've let you do your sad little ballerina thing, but my patience has run out." He gestured with the cash. "This is what people want. Fun, escape, sizzle, not a funeral dirge in slow motion." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, final threat. "So no advance, and here's the deal. You have this week. Start dancing like you mean business, like you want to make men spend money. Or next Wednesday, you won't be dancing here at all." The stage had never felt so much like a cage. The familiar bass beat was a hammer against her skull. The lights, usually a soft cocoon, felt like interrogators' lamps, exposing every ounce of her failure. She moved, but it was purely mechanical. The language was gone. In its place were the jerky, hollow motions of a marionette whose strings had been tangled and cut. There was no story, no connection, only the desperate, frantic movements of a drowning person. Her eyes, against her will, found the corner booth. Tom was there, a solid shape in the chaos. He was watching, as always, his expression unreadable. But tonight, she had nothing to offer him. Her gaze met his across the smoky room, and it wasn't a performance anymore. It was a plea, a raw, silent scream into the void, hoping for an echo that she knew would never come. The music faded into a dull, distant throb the moment she pushed open the fire escape door. The back alley greeted her with a blast of cold, damp air that smelled of grime-slicked brick, stale beer, and wet cardboard. She leaned against the wall, the rough brick biting into her back, and slid down to the cracked pavement. There were no dramatic sobs, just a dry, ragged sound that was the sound of a spirit breaking. Her body folded in on itself, a silent surrender in the shadows. The world had shrunk to this small, filthy patch of concrete. A few minutes passed, measured in the slow drips from an overflowing gutter. Then, a sound cut through her misery, the soft scuff of worn leather shoes on asphalt. "Your dance tonight, it didn't tell a story." The voice was hoarse but gentle, worn smooth with age. Zara's head shot up, her eyes blurry with tears. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the alley. It was Tom. He stood a few feet away, his his overcoat buttoned against the chill, his face etched with a concern that was miles away from pity. He held out a handkerchief. It was impeccably clean, folded into a neat square, and smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. She stared at it, then at him, too stunned to move. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean to intrude, but I saw you leave. You looked heavy." He didn't say sad or upset. He said heavy asterisk. The word landed with perfect, devastating accuracy. She finally took the handkerchief, her fingers numb. I don't understand," she whispered. "You watch me every week." "I do," he confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "My wife, Elena, she passed away 4 years ago. She was an art therapist. For 30 years she worked with veterans, men who came back from wars with their souls full of shrapnel that no doctor could see. They couldn't talk about it. So, Elena taught them to move, to show her with their hands what fear felt like, to use their posture to explain loss." He looked past Zara for a moment, into a memory. She had this phrase she always used. She said the most profound form of communication, the greatest gift you can give another human, is to make them feel truly seen asterisk. Not judged, not analyzed, but simply seen. He brought his eyes back to Zara, and in them she saw a universe of grief and love. "The first time I saw you dance, months ago, I almost walked out. This place, it's not my world. But then I saw what you were doing. You were looking for the lonely ones. You were telling them you saw them. Your dance, young lady, it has that same quiet, powerful magic. It's the language Elena spoke." He took a small, shaky breath. "I don't come here for the whiskey. I come here to see a ghost, a beautiful one. I come to see the work my wife did, her legacy of compassion, living on in the most unlikely place I could ever imagine." The tears that had been born of despair began to change. They welled up again, hot and overwhelming, but this time they weren't for her broken dreams or her financial ruin. They were for the breathtaking, impossible kindness of this stranger, who had seen the most hidden part of her and called it by its name. In the grimy back alley of the Velvet Midnight, under a single, buzzing security light, Zara felt, for the first time in years, completely and utterly seen. Tom's words hung in the cold air, a lifeline thrown into the dark well of her despair. He didn't offer to pay her mother's bill. He didn't offer charity. He offered something far more profound, a purpose. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet from which he extracted not money, but a simple business card. "Oak Creek Community Center," Zara read aloud, the crisp white card a stark contrast to her grimy fingers. A name was printed underneath: Martha Ribeiro, director. Martha was Elena's dearest friend, Tom explained. They built programs together for years. The center, it has a lot of members like me, people whose worlds have grown quiet. They have card games and book clubs, but Martha's been looking for something more, something to help with the loneliness that words can't always reach. He looked at her, his eyes full of a conviction that momentarily silenced her own doubt. "I think she's been looking for you." The next day passed in a blur of anxiety and a fragile, terrifying hope. She didn't go to the club. Instead, she clutched the business card in her pocket like a talisman and took 2 buses to a part of the city she'd never seen, where the houses had small, neat lawns. The Oak Creek Community Center was a low brick building, smelling of floor polish, strong coffee, and something vaguely like cinnamon. It was everything the Velvet Midnight was not: bright, clean, and utterly unpretentious. Tom was waiting for her inside, and he introduced her to Martha, a woman with kind, tired eyes and a firm handshake. In a quiet activity room, a dozen seniors were seated in a semicircle of plastic chairs. They looked at Zara with a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. Their bodies were stiff, their faces guarded. Panic flared in Zara's chest. What was she doing here? These weren't anonymous faces in a dark club. These were people with entire lifetimes etched into their faces. Then she remembered Tom's words: "Make them feel seen." She took a deep breath and stepped into the center of the circle. She didn't turn on any music. "We're not going to dance," she began, her voice softer than she intended. We're just going to talk but without using our voices. She held up her hand. Can you show me, just with your fingers, what regret looks like? A long silence. A few people exchanged confused glances. Then, an elderly man with gnarled, arthritic hands, the one she later learned was a retired carpenter, slowly curled his fingers into a tight, frustrated fist. Across the circle, a woman with a pearl necklace delicately, almost imperceptibly, traced a line on her own palm, as if trying to erase something. Zara nodded, her heart starting to beat with a new rhythm. Good, she whispered. Now, can you use your shoulders to tell me the story of a warm, comforting hug you once received? This time, the shift was more pronounced. A woman in a lavender sweater who hadn't met Zara's eyes until now slowly wrapped her own arms around herself. Her chin dropped to her chest, and a single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. The carpenter, his fist now unclenched, lifted his hands, palms up, in a gesture that was not quite a hug, but a powerful, clumsy offering of protection. A man in the back simply let his shoulders slump forward, a profound, weary release. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken stories, with the weight of memory and feeling. Zara guided them through more prompts. Open your hands as if releasing something you've held too tightly. Show me the shape of a stubborn hope. They moved, not with the grace of dancers, but with the unpolished, breathtaking honesty of lived experience. In that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by the creaks and sighs of aging bodies, Zara finally understood. This was the stage she had been searching for her entire life. The emotional expression through movement class at Oak Creek became a quiet phenomenon. It started with one session a week, then quickly grew to 3. Martha Ribeiro, seeing the profound change in her members, found funding in a community arts grant. Zara was offered a formal contract as a part-time instructor. The salary wasn't extravagant, but it was steady. It was dignified, and it was more than enough to cover her mother's enhanced care at Meadowlark, with a little left over. The day she walked away from the Velvet Midnight for the last time, leaving Sal sputtering in disbelief, she felt no anger or triumph, only a quiet, liberating lightness. Her new stage was a polished linoleum floor, bathed in the gentle afternoon sun. Her audience was no longer a blur of transient faces, but a community. There was Mr. Abernathy, the retired carpenter, who learned to use his hands not just to show the strength of building things, but the fragility of holding a memory. There was Eleanor Vance, the woman in the lavender sweater, who had been cocooned in grief since her husband's passing 2 years prior. In class, she slowly began to unfurl, her movements telling stories of their life together, a shared dance in their long-ago kitchen, the comforting weight of his hand on her back. Zara was no longer just a dancer. She was a translator, a conduit. She taught them how to articulate the things for which they had no words, and in doing so, she learned to listen with her entire being. She saw their loneliness, their pride, their hidden joys, and their lingering sorrows. In return, they gave her their trust. They saw her not as a performer, but as a gentle guide who had given them back a part of themselves they thought was lost forever. Tom Caldwell became a regular fixture, but not in a corner booth. He sat among the participants, a quiet but active member of the class. One afternoon, Zara asked the group to show her the meaning of legacy. Tom, who usually moved with a reserved stillness, stood up. He walked to the center of the room and extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture of offering. Then, with his other hand, he gently mimed placing something unseen into that open palm, closing the fingers around it, and then pushing it forward, a gift to the world. It was a perfect, silent poem of his wife's life and the work she had passed on. In that moment, Zara knew he wasn't just seeing Eleanor's ghost in her anymore. He was seeing her asterisk. Her own life began to heal. The gnawing anxiety was replaced by a sense of purpose. The shame of the club dissolved into the quiet pride of her new work. Her art was no longer a desperate whisper in the dark, but a clear, resonant voice in the light, creating ripples of connection that healed not only others, but herself. The faded poster of Asterisk Swan Lake remained on her wall, but it was no longer a symbol of a failed dream. It was simply the beginning of a story that had taken an unexpected, winding, and ultimately beautiful path to find its true stage.